Hello YouTube, this is Andrew K4 with a new video series called Bettering Your Bachmann. For episode 1, we will be talking about the locomotives that were present at the completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad, these being Central Pacific No. 60, the Jupiter, and Union Pacific 119. On May 10, 1869, history was made when Central Pacific and Union Pacific met at Promontory Summit, Utah, completing the first Transcontinental Railroad. Two locomotives be cemented in history through famous photos, these being Central Pacific No. 60, named Jupiter, and Union Pacific's more modest 119. Both these locomotives would go on to have long careers, eventually being sold to other railroads and unfortunately scrapped in the early 20th century. With the centenary of the driving of the Golden Spike approaching in 1969, preservationists were already decades late to preserve the original locomotives, and the rails were ripped out during a scrap metal drive in World War II. Despite these hiccups, celebrations were still in order. A small section of track was relaid, and two similarly vintage locomotives from the Virginia and Truckee Railroad were trucked in and dressed like Jupiter and 119, until new working replicas could be built. While the new locomotives may have had some deviations in paint color, they were very close to the real locomotives from 1869. Many model railroaders are familiar with the classic 440s that Bachmann has been making since the 1980s. These engines do not have the best reputation, as the motor is in the tender and they often stall out. Jupiter and 119 were some of the first road names offered. When the tooling was made, Bachmann used the Virginia and Truckee locomotives as reference. They used almost the same tooling, except for some slight variations, depending on the road name. From a distance, the differences are minor, but when looking at the replicas, a lot of missing details become obvious. I knew at some point I wanted to get models of the iconic duo, but I would want to make a lot of cosmetic changes to better reflect the real and replica locomotives. In 2016, Bachmann made some much-needed changes to their 440s. The new Bachmann 440s modernized the classic locomotive in many ways. The motor was moved to the locomotive, so DCC and sound could be added to the tender. An LED light was added with a very convenient plug for body shell removal. Fuel specific to the road names was a very welcome change, along with a variety of new and old road names. The first new tooling 440 I acquired was a Pennsylvania Railroad 566, and the differences between the old and the new tooling were quite evident. This locomotive will be the subject of its own video, because the project I will be going on to here is slightly more ambitious. Earlier this year, I finally found a Jupiter for a decent price. This one didn't have DCC or sound, but those could easily be installed later. The first subtle change I made was to add some paint details Bachmann skipped on. This included adding red inside the gold trim on the headlight, adding darker, more Russian iron boiler, and painting the tender wheels and trucks to a more appropriate blue and red. While the trucks are not a perfect match to the prototype, the arch-bar trucks are a lot better looking than the old V&T style. I also painted the smoke box a matte charcoal color, and the top of the running boards first in blue and later in black. Another quick and often overlooked paint job is the inside of the cab. Most locomotives had a green paint in the interior, and while this may have not been the case for Jupiter and 119, it was present in the replicas. I very carefully painted the inside walls and underside of the roof green, being careful not to get any on the window glazing. While the cab was off, I also painted the back head in the same charcoal gray as the smoke box. I would love to add some more details to the back head, as an open cab is another thing Bachmann has improved on over their solid block cabs of the original tooling. Nonetheless, the last detail for now was to add an engineer. While the new cab is a lot more open, there are still 3 metal weights that stop just about level with the cab windows. This means that any crew in the cab were going to have to be cut in half to fit. I had a spare crew figure from a proto-diesel that was in rough shape anyway, so I used plastic fill to carefully shape a new cowboy-style hat and painted him to look more western. I did the deed and fixed him into the cab. Another subtle detail, but great to see. I will add a standing fireman to the tender at some point. Woodburners like Jupiter would need constant attention after all. Speaking of tenders, one thing I like to do is add real coal to my models. In the case of Jupiter, this would mean adding real wood instead. I have already done a similar job on an old Rivarossi 440, so doing it here wasn't a problem. I took a huge chunk of wood I found in the sawdust pit and started cutting off small chunks of wood. Then I glued them over the pre-existing wood load until it was almost completely covered. Unlike the Rivarossi model, which is simulated to mock a wood load over an oil tank, I also used some wood in the front part of the tender to give the load more depth. The end result is a lot better than the simulated wood on the model. That got most of the minor cosmetic work done. Now I was on to work on the heavy mods. One of the first things I wanted to replace was the steam dome. While CalScale used to make sand and steam domes for Jupiter and 119, they are a bit tricky to find. Luckily, I had a brass steam dome from a Tycho 460 that was a very similar shape. I put it in a drill and sanded away any ridge lines, then polished to a lovely shine. Definitely a huge improvement over the inaccurate plastic one. The new tooled 440s also were made with easy make couplers on the pilot. This is a nice improvement as it allows most modelers to switch or double head the locomotives, though it's a bit of an eyesore if you're trying to model 1860s vintage locomotives. Luckily, brass replacement pilots from this era are pretty easy to come by. I bought 2 brass pilots from Precision Scale, and though they were good castings, they lacked any kind of coupling. Before knuckle couplers were invented, railroads mainly used link and pin couplers. On locomotives with huge pilots, this would mean you would need a long drawbar to clear the pilot so it wouldn't crush anything the locomotive was trying to push. I was able to make 2 drawbars from very thin plastic. While these are non-functioning, they look better than the knuckle, and even the old tooled 440s that did not have any couplers modeled at all. With the parts ready, I removed the coupler and cut off the pilot. After some filing to a more square shape, I glued and painted the new pilot. Another part that was removed was the decorative builder's plates that was in between the driving wheels. These are present on the old tool models and are accurate to some Central Pacific locomotives, but not Jupiter. These are easy to remove with the connecting rods out of the way. Speaking of connecting rods, while the metal finish is nice, I did paint over these with a silver paint marker. Why? Because I wanted the finish to match closer to the valve motion that Bachmann did not bother picking out. Also, most locomotives probably wouldn't have a shiny metal finish, and the replicas look more silver in finish anyway. Another modification that was a bit more ambitious was the headlight assembly. The real Jupiter's headlight was very ornate and slightly spindly. While the headlight itself has been upgraded to an LED on the model, the bracket itself has not changed much. It's an okay casting, but not very accurate. There is only so much one can do to improve the look, but I wanted to raise the headlight platform off the bracket. I tried a couple of methods, but they were all extremely hard to mount in a way that wouldn't break. I also split the bracket in 2 sections as per the prototype. This made putting the final assembly together a bit of a pain, but much better looking. I then painted the brackets blue and using a toothpick added a bit of red around the holes in the casting. One thing that all the Bachmann 440s have in common is their water injectors. The ones modeled are fairly close to the ones 119 had, but the molding is tiny and has no depth. This is a shame because both locomotive water injectors are very ornate and unique, with a brass finish. Luckily, I was able to get the CalScale castings for both Jupiter and 119. It was just a matter of trimming the sprue and filing and bending to the right shape. I carefully cut off the molded-in water injector and drilled a small hole in the boiler to mount them. I did need to glue a spot on the bottom of the simulated motion to make it more secure. The end result makes Jupiter really stand out compared to the other Bachmann 440s. Last was to add the bells and whistles, somewhat literally. The model when I bought it had a slightly damaged bell. These are separately fitted plastic pieces, and it broke off more or less flush with the top of the boiler. Despite several attempts to glue it back on, it would easily fall off. I decided to try a slightly unorthodox experiment. I took a handrail stanchion and carefully filed it down top till it was smooth. Then I carefully trimmed the bell casting to have a flat bottom and glued the bell on top of the bracket. I could then drill out a new hole to mount the bell more securely. So far, this has worked pretty well. Next up was the whistle. I was not able to find an appropriate brass one at the time, so searching through my spare detail parts, I was able to find one that looked close enough. I then drilled a hole to fit the whistle into the steam dome. Last was to cut and bend a small piece of brass wire to simulate the whistle cord. This was mounted to the cab, so it can still remove it in the future. One last small detail that may catch your attention is the small handle under the number plate on the front of the locomotive. I believe this is what is referred to as a dart, in English railroad terms anyway, and this was a feature on many early American locomotives as well. This was a super tiny piece of wire that was carefully glued under the number board at a similar angle to that of the replica. While my custom models are almost never completely done, this is the extent of the work that I've got for Jupiter, for now anyway. Next up, we'll take a look at Union Pacific 119. Much of the build process for 119 was similar to Jupiter, both getting painted tender trucks and wheels, charcoal smoke boxes, and backheads, with 119 getting the smokestack painted as well. I then white-walled the wheels on the locomotive and tender. 119 also received an upgraded water feed with a similar process to Jupiter, though 119 had a bit more detail on the fireman's side. One thing that always bothered me about 119 models is despite having the extended smoke box, the headlights still needed the same bracket as a Jupiter. While I can understand why they would do this from a structural standpoint, I knew that it had to go on any 119 variant I get. I already did a proof of concept with my Penzi 440, removing the headlight bracket from the headlight mounting, then drilling holes for the headlight to fit directly to the smoke box. For 119, I opted to use plastic fill around the base to secure and remove the gap in between the headlight and the smoke box. I also used this time to drill out a vent at the top of the headlight. Another thing that is a huge eyesore on the 119 model is the bell. The real 119's bell is a very ornate cast piece that, to be fair, would be extremely fragile at this scale. But Bachmann made a bell that was sandwiched in between what can only be described as two flat hot dog buns that have been squeezed in the middle. The Penzi variant, thankfully, did not have this abomination, but this would be something that would have to go on 119. Another more subtle detail was the top of the sand dome. The real one had a ribbed design that was more ornate than the smooth round one on the Bachmann model. Another slightly glaring detail is the cab. In order to save on production cost, Bachmann used the same cab design for all of their 440s. While I could overlook this detail on Jupiter, 119's cab had tall, rounded windows, not to mention that for some reason, the cab is almost a cream color as opposed to the stained wood as the original and the replica. As far as the cab goes, I thought that if I can't find a suitable replacement, the least I could do is get rid of the cream color. I watched a video from LMM on using wood stain markers on old Hornby LNER teak coaches to make them look more accurate. I have some of these myself, and sure enough, it works wonders. I thought that this trick might also work on 119's cab as well. The results were definitely an improvement. Though with new releases of the 440s having a brown wooden cab, one can hope that they can use this for any future releases of 119. The solution to the bell, sand dome, and cab would be a bit of an unorthodox, and some might say sacrilege, method. I have a static silver model of 119 that was cast by pewter. While I wasn't going to destroy this model because it had a tender, I did purchase a 119 locomotive to use for spare parts. I carefully cut the pieces I wanted with a Dremel, then did any necessary filing. The belt cast on the pewter model is much nicer. I did carefully drill some of the open spaces and use a knife to carefully carve away the metal around the bell. I drilled a mounting hole, painted the bell in gold, and the bell mount in a spiceberry red, then added it to the boiler. Already a world of improvement. I did a similar job with the sand dome top, cutting off the original, painting the metal one, and gluing it in place. The cab was a bit more tricky. The cast one comes off in 4 pieces, the 2 sides with the back and the front and the roof. I painted these a reddish brown on the outside and green on the inside, though I did eventually take the wood stain marker to the outside as well. The roof was painted the same red as the pilot, bell mount, and sand dome. In order for the front piece to fit, I needed to trim the boiler where the original cab was mounted. This was a bit tedious as the soft metal wanted to bend every time I tested the fit. Thankfully, it did not break. Another problem was getting the sides to fit. Because of the weights in the cab, I had to both shave these down slightly and carefully cut the inside of the cab walls on both sides to get it to sit relatively snug with the front piece. What I would like to do at some point is make castings of the sand dome and the cab, as I would need them for another Bachmann 440 that I would like to modify in the future. In the end, this was all very worth it, as the locomotive looks a lot closer to the real 119. Another big modification was the 119's tender. For some reason, when Bachmann upgraded these, the coal tenders lost the toolboxes. 119 had at least 3, maybe 4 toolboxes on top. While I was able to salvage the toolboxes that were on the frames and in the back, also removed from Jupiter, I would need 1 more. I was able to find a pretty close brass casting, and I cut the old Bachmann toolbox in half to create the other. Both Bachmann toolboxes were patched with plastic sheet and fill. The real 119's tender tank is slightly longer than the Bachmann. This caused a slight issue with the back toolbox overlapping with the water fill cap. Between this and the toolboxes needing to be mounted, I decided the best solution would be to cut out most of the tender top. I took off the tender shell and used a knife I carefully scribed and cut out the top. Then I cut a bit off the front and extended the back with a styrene to fit. I also used this time to cut notches for the toolboxes to sit in. I glued the top back in place and used plastic fill to fill in any of the gaps. The last 2 steps were to add real coal to the top and wood planking to the front of the tender. Another detail that Bachmann overlooked on the extended smokebox locomotives was the handrail. Most locomotives that I've seen with this either have handrails that go all the way to the very front. In the case of 119, it wrapped all the way around the front. Luckily, I have already done a similar mod with my Penzi 440, so I knew what I needed to be done. I found 2 spare handrail stanchions, drilled holes in line with the others on top of the boiler, and mounted them in place. Unlike my Penzi model, I decided that I would make the handrails in 3 pieces. This was so I can take off the smoke box extension if I needed to. So the 2 original handrails were shortened slightly, so the third one in the front could notch into the original first stanchion. I then glued them in place so they stay relatively level. 119 was finished off with some other subtle details. The real locomotives had paintings of American folk heroes on the side of the sand domes. While it would be impossible to make a perfect replicas of these in HO scale, I used similar colors to stand in. Looks a lot better than having nothing on there at all. I also added a brass whistle, as somehow the original plastic one broke off. Honestly, it looks a lot better as a brass part. Overall, I'm very happy with the way 119 turned out. Though, like Jupiter, 119 is not quite finished. I would like to add crew figures and backhead details. Maybe add flag stands to the pilot and trim the tender frame. But with both locomotives near completion, that just leaves something for them to pull. I hope you enjoyed this video, and are maybe inspired to do your own take of Jupiter in 119. I have a bunch of these scripts lined up, so if you'd like to see those, like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, this is Andrew K4, signing out.